Ethan Marrow had built empires from nothing but grit, sleepless nights, and the hollow echo of rooms he bought just to fill with the validation he never received as a boy. And although the world called him a millionaire, a prodigy, the kind of man who turned failing companies into titanium giants, deep inside he was nothing more than a wounded soul looking for silence, and that was why on a windy Wednesday, after signing away yet another company he no longer cared about, he drove into the forgotten edges of South Carolina with only a duffel bag, a notebook filled with scratched-out dreams, and a pain behind his ribs that felt like a bruise no doctor could diagnose. He wasn't looking for comfort nor luxury nor the polished floors of penthouses. He was looking for a place so stripped, so unimpressed by wealth, that maybe it could finally let him breathe. So when he saw the shack, crooked porch, rust-lightened roof, vines crawling like stubborn memories up its faded boards, he didn't flinch, didn't think, he simply bought it in cash from a man who stared at him like he was insane. And Ethan didn't deny that maybe he was a little insane after losing the fiancée who left him 3 days before their wedding, taking with her not only the ring but also the future he'd rehearsed in his heart. So he stepped onto the porch, inhaled the thick scent of pine and earth, and felt for the first time in months that the world wasn't spinning too fast. But everything changed when he unlocked the door and froze, because sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor, holding 2 tiny babies who couldn't have been more than 6 months old, was a young black woman with tired eyes, beautiful in a way that didn't feel like beauty but endurance, like someone who'd been pushed by life and still refused to break, and she stared at him with a terror so sharp he instinctively raised his hands as if to show he meant no harm, and before he could even ask her name, she whispered, "Please don't call the police," with a tremble that struck straight into the bruised part of him, the part familiar with being hunted by expectations he didn't choose. And Ethan, momentarily robbed of speech, noticed how the twins clung to her shirt, how the room had an overturned chair, a pile of diapers, and a backpack half unzipped as if she'd been seconds from fleeing. And though he was a man who lived by logic, profit, and risk analysis, something in him snapped away from logic and into something closer to instinct. So instead of demanding answers, he said softly, "I'm not calling anyone. Start from wherever you can." And she took a shaking breath, introducing herself as Nia, explaining between stutters and tears that she had nowhere else to go, that the father of her twins, a man she trusted, a man she thought loved her, had disappeared 2 months ago after leaving her with debts she didn't even know he'd taken in her name, that collectors had shown up at her apartment screaming threats, and the landlord, a man twice her age with intentions she'd sensed long before he said them out loud, told her she could stay only if she was willing to negotiate. So she grabbed her babies and fled in the middle of the night, living out of bus stations, churches, and abandoned structures until finally stumbling across this shack, never knowing someone still owned it. And Ethan sat on the creaking floor with her, his $1,000 jeans brushing against dust like it was the most natural thing in the world, listening to her unravel, and he realized her story wasn't one of irresponsible choices but one of survival, of a world that punished the vulnerable while pretending to offer opportunity. And as lightning flickered through the small broken window, he felt an unexpected protectiveness swell inside him, the kind of feeling he hadn't felt since he rescued stray animals as a child before his father beat that softness out of him. But before he could say anything in response, the twins began crying in mismatched pitches, Nia apologizing instantly, rocking them with practiced movements despite her trembling fingers, and Ethan, awkwardly but earnestly, offered to hold one, surprising both of them. And when the baby quieted in his arms, something in him cracked open like a door he didn't know was locked, because the tiny weight on his chest pulled him out of his own misery, even if temporarily. And Nia saw the change in his expression, the softness, and for the first time she didn't look like she was preparing to run. Yet the night wasn't done twisting, because when a car engine growled outside, Nia's face drained of color, and she lunged forward to snatch both babies back, whispering, "They found me." And Ethan, heart pounding, peeked through the slanted blinds to see a black sedan idling too close to the porch, its headlights off, its presence wrong, and he felt anger, real anger, rise like fire through his chest, a fire he thought he'd lost when he gave up fighting for anything real. But here it was again, sharp and bright, and without overthinking, he stepped onto the porch into the humid night, his voice cold and steady as he called out, "Can I help you?" Knowing fully that whoever was in that car wasn't there for anything good. And when the sedan peeled away into the trees, leaving only dust swirling under the moonlight, Ethan turned back toward the shack, realizing that whatever he'd stepped into wasn't just a coincidence or temporary refuge but a storm pulling him into something larger than himself. A story of danger, betrayal, hidden truths, and a woman whose resilience illuminated corners of his soul he thought were long dead. And as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him, Nia whispered, "They'll come back," and Ethan, surprising even himself, replied, "Then they'll find me waiting." Ethan didn't sleep that night, though the humid air thickened into a slow-moving fog that wrapped around the shack like a warning, and as dawn pushed its first pale light between the cracked boards of the window, he sat with his back against the wall, listening to the soft breaths of Nia and the twins, who had finally drifted to sleep in a nest of blankets he'd unearthed from a forgotten storage trunk. The night's scare lingered in him like static, and though his mind had once been trained to calculate profits and losses, today it calculated risk in a new currency: safety, vulnerability, unpredictability, the sharp edge of fear in someone else's voice. And the more he replayed the moment the sedan pulled up, the more determined he became that no one, absolutely no one, was going to harm Nia or those children while he was here. So when Nia woke with the puffy-eyed exhaustion of someone who hadn't felt truly safe in months, she looked at him with both gratitude and apology shimmering between her lashes. But before she could apologize for dragging him into her mess, Ethan cut her off gently and told her he wasn't leaving, and though she didn't fully believe him, the relief in her shoulders gave her away, and so the morning unfolded slowly, cautiously, with him repairing the broken window while she fed the twins with the last of her formula, and he made mental notes of everything they needed: food, diapers, clothing, locks, electricity restoration, and every note sharpened into a single thought. Whoever was hunting Nia would eventually return, and when they did, they'd find a different man waiting for them, a man who'd run multi-million-dollar negotiations but was just as capable of defending 4 fragile lives in the middle of nowhere. Around midday, after he repaired the shattered frame and cleared out the overgrown path around the shack, the two of them sat on the porch eating sandwiches made of whatever expired canned goods he'd found in the pantry, and though the food tasted like cardboard, the air felt lighter because for the first time Nia laughed. A real soft laugh that shook dust off the gloom, and Ethan watched her as though the sound itself stitched something in him back together. And it was in that quiet moment, while the twins napped inside, that Nia finally revealed more of her truth. Not the polished version, not the survival summary she'd shakily given him last night, but the deeper, messy truth she hadn't shared with anyone. That the man she'd been with wasn't just a boyfriend but the kind of charming liar people want to believe. The kind who painted futures with words but left destruction with actions, the kind who pressured her into signing documents she didn't understand, trapping her in a financial net she couldn't escape, and when she confronted him, he disappeared with her savings, leaving behind not only debt collectors but men who claimed she now owed far more than she'd ever seen, and Ethan could see in her eyes the shame she still carried, the shame that wasn't hers to bear but had latched on anyway, and he listened, really listened, without judgment, without interruption, until she took a deep breath and admitted that the sedan last night looked eerily like the one whose driver had threatened her outside a bus station 2 weeks ago. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he promised her, not with flowery words, but with the steel in his voice, that he would handle it. But even as he made that vow, he felt the flicker of complication because he wasn't just protecting her from faceless threats now. He was stepping into a much bigger storm, one that involved real danger, real stakes, and real consequences he couldn't buy himself out of. But something within him insisted that this was the path he was meant to walk. So they made a plan. He would drive into town, buy supplies, check on whether anyone had asked about a young woman with twins, and return before dark, while she would stay hidden inside the shack with the babies, keeping low, keeping quiet. It sounded simple, too simple, and Ethan felt the itch of anticipation as he slid behind the wheel of his old Jeep, an impulsive purchase he'd made purely because it didn't fit in with any of the luxury vehicles he used to own. And as he drove down the gravel road, dust kicking into the trees like ghostly smoke, he kept replaying the way Nia had looked at him before he left. A mixture of trust and fear, of hope she was scared to feel, and he knew he couldn't fail her. Arriving in town was like stepping into a different world. Slow-paced, unpolished, with buildings that leaned like tired elders and locals who eyed strangers with suspicion. So when Ethan walked into the small general store and filled his cart with formula, diapers, canned goods, linens, batteries, and a set of heavy-duty locks, he could feel the old woman behind the counter assessing him, and when she asked what brought him around these parts, he simply said he'd recently moved into the old cabin by the pines, the one nobody wanted, and the way her eyebrows shot up made something flicker in his chest. She leaned in slightly and said, "Strange noises out that way lately, cars coming and going at night," and Ethan realized instantly that the sedan from last night wasn't the first time someone had been prowling around, and though he stayed calm on the outside, inside him every instinct went sharp, and he thanked her, paid in cash, and loaded the supplies quickly, noticing in his peripheral vision a man leaning against a pickup across the street, staring too long, too intently, the kind of stare that wasn't mere curiosity. But Ethan didn't react. He'd been in too many boardrooms where sharks circled with smiles, and he drove off at a steady pace, watching in the rearview mirror until the town disappeared behind him. Yet the gravel crunching under his tires wasn't enough to drown the unease blooming in his spine, because halfway back to the shack, he noticed a second set of tire tracks in the mud beside his own, fresh, weaving off into the dense trees toward a trail he hadn't taken, and his stomach dropped as he imagined someone approaching the cabin while he was gone. So he sped up, adrenaline forming a cold knot under his ribs, and when he finally burst through the clearing and saw the shack still standing, no signs of intrusion, he exhaled in relief, until he saw Nia on the porch, clutching one twin in each arm, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and urgency. She whispered his name before he even stopped the car, and when he ran to her, she spilled out that someone had come by, a tall man with a scar across his temple, knocking aggressively, calling her name, insisting she open the door, and though she stayed silent and hidden, he lingered for several minutes before disappearing back into the woods. Ethan felt a cold fury ignite, a fury not loud but precise, and though he didn't show it, he was already recalculating everything. Their safety, their location, their next moves, and the creeping reality that this situation was spiraling faster than he could patch it. But instead of panicking, he shifted into action, installing the new locks, reinforcing the doors, setting up makeshift alarms using cans and fishing lines like his grandfather once taught him, and organizing supplies inside. And as evening approached, the two of them sat on the floor amid the twins' soft coos, sharing quiet words, their shoulders brushing occasionally, each accidental touch sending a current. Neither spoke aloud, and for the first time since arriving at the shack, Nia reached out and held his hand, just briefly, but enough to say thank you, enough to say she wasn't alone, enough to say she believed in him. Yet when night fell completely and the cicadas started their eerie symphony, another twist arrived, this one quieter, subtler, but just as dangerous, because as Ethan double-checked the window locks, he noticed something pressed between the porch boards, something metallic reflecting the moonlight, and when he pried it out, his heart clenched. It was a burner phone, left intentionally, its screen flashing a single message written in all caps, a message that made Ethan's breath freeze as he read. "We know she's with you, don't make this worse." And as he stepped back into the shack, gripping the phone with a tightening fist, Nia looked at him and instantly knew something had shifted, and though he didn't want to scare her, he couldn't lie, because whatever danger she'd been running from had now officially marked him too, tangled him in a web he couldn't escape, and though fear grew in the corners of Nia's eyes, something else sparked too. Trust, reliance, and the fragile beginning of a bond neither of them expected but both desperately needed. And as thunder rumbled in the distance, Ethan realized this battle was no longer about a shack in the woods or a millionaire trying to escape his own pain. This was now a collision of two broken worlds forced together by fate, chased by danger, and headed toward a truth so explosive that nothing in either of their lives would ever be the same again. The night deepened into the kind of darkness that swallows outlines and makes even familiar shapes look like strangers, and the shack, with its patched-up windows and newly reinforced doors, felt both like a sanctuary and a fragile secret clinging to survival. As Ethan stood in the middle of the room gripping the burner phone, his pulse hammering in a rhythm that didn't belong to fear alone but to determination sharpened by the weight of everything at stake, Nia, the twins, the fragile trust blooming between them, and the truth that he could not, would not, let danger walk through that door. The rain began as a whisper against the roof, then grew into a wild drumming that made the woods roar like a living thing, and Nia sat holding the twins close, murmuring soft reassurance even though her eyes revealed she was the one who most needed comforting. And when Ethan knelt before her, telling her calmly, but with a crack of fire beneath his voice, that the men after her weren't just debt collectors or petty criminals but something larger, something organized, something that didn't mind crossing lines to get what they wanted, she swallowed hard and admitted something she hadn't been able to say aloud until this very moment. That the father of her children wasn't merely irresponsible or manipulative but had been dealing with dangerous people, using her identity as a shield, and though she didn't know the details, she remembered overhearing a conversation months ago about moves in Charleston, money laundering, and loose ends, but she didn't understand enough at the time to recognize just how deep the darkness ran. And Ethan felt the ground tilt beneath him as he realized this wasn't just about protecting a woman and two babies. It was about outmaneuvering a network of men who believed they owned her life, and now believed they had a reason to come after him as well. But instead of panic, Ethan felt clarity, the kind he always felt during the most ruthless business mergers, the kind where everything unnecessary fell away and only strategy remained, and he told Nia that running would no longer work, hiding would no longer work, and they needed to turn the tables, and the shock in her eyes softened into something new. Something like faith, as she nodded and let him take the burner phone apart, pulling the battery, examining the casing, discovering a tiny tracking chip embedded where a casual observer wouldn't notice, which meant the enemy already knew the general region but not the exact spot, and Ethan realized the phone had been bait, meant to provoke fear and lure them out, but now it would serve a different purpose. he grabbed his notebook, the one filled with business plans and abandoned dreams, and began sketching a strategy that mirrored the same tactics used in hostile takeovers: misdirection, leverage, timing, psychological traps, and it was surreal to repurpose skills meant for corporate warfare into survival, but the lines between battles blurred when lives were at stake, and so he explained the plan to Nia. He would take the phone far from the shack, leaving false tracks toward an abandoned logging mill he'd seen on the way into town, drawing the men toward him while she stayed hidden with the children. But Nia refused, tears burning her eyes, saying she couldn't let him risk his life alone, not after all he'd done, not after he'd stepped into a storm he never asked for. But Ethan placed his hand gently on her cheek, brushing away a tear with a tenderness that surprised even him, and he told her the truth. That saving her wasn't an obligation, it was a choice, one he wanted to make, one he felt in every part of him, because she had filled the silence inside him with purpose, and as she leaned into his touch, the air between them shifted into something raw and unspoken, something neither of them dared name but both felt like a tremor under their ribs. But there was no time for softness with danger closing in, so Ethan prepared quickly, loading the jeep with decoys, blankets tied into the shape of bodies, bags weighted to simulate luggage, carefully placing the cracked phone atop them to give the illusion of movement, and before he left, he turned back to Nia, who stood barefoot on the worn floor, clutching one twin while the other slept in a makeshift cradle, and she whispered, "Come back to me," and those 4 words rooted so deeply into him that he knew he could never walk away from her. Not now, not after everything. He drove off into the night, the jeep's headlights slicing through the downpour, and every mile he put between himself and the shack was both a risk and a tether being tested, but he followed the plan meticulously, circling through the woods until he reached the old mill, its rusted metal skeleton looming like a ghost, and left the decoy inside, using a piece of rebar to smash tracks in the mud to resemble hurried footsteps, then tossed the phone onto a stack of rotting pallets before slipping back into the forest on foot, navigating through thickets and mud with the focus of a man who had no margin for error. Meanwhile, back at the shack, Nia paced with the twins tucked against her chest, every creak of the floorboards making her flinch, and she prayed quietly, not just for safety, but for Ethan, for the man who had stepped into her catastrophe without hesitation, for the strange miracle of his presence in her life, for the terrifying possibility that she had begun to care for him with a depth she didn't understand. And then, just as the storm began to break, headlights cut through the trees, not Ethan's Jeep but a black SUV this time, larger, heavier, predatory, and Nia's breath caught in her throat as she crouched behind the table, clutching her babies tightly while boots slammed onto the porch and heavy fists pounded on the door, demanding entry, the voice outside unmistakably the scar-templed man who had hunted her before. But before panic could paralyze her completely, a loud crash echoed from the woods, drawing the men's attention, and they cursed, retreating toward the sound, assuming the tracker had led them to their target, unaware that Ethan was already behind them, watching from the shadows with a broken branch gripped like a weapon, his heart pounding in a rhythm fueled not by fear but by something fiercer. What happened next unfolded quickly. The men reached the mill, breaking inside with guns raised, shouting commands over each other, only to find the decoy, the empty blankets, the false trail. And in their confusion, storming deeper inside, Ethan seized the moment, slipping to their SUV and slashing the tires with a sharp stone before retreating again into the woods, the rain masking his steps, knowing that immobilizing their vehicle would buy precious minutes. But when the men realized they'd been tricked, their rage erupted into gunshots that tore through the mill's rotten walls, and one shouted that they'd deal with the woman first, and Ethan's blood ran cold as they began running back toward the shack. Faster now, reckless, dangerous, Ethan sprinted through the trees, branches whipping his face, mud sucking at his feet, lungs burning, but nothing mattered except reaching Nia before they did, and when he burst from the woods into the clearing, he saw the men only yards from the porch, one climbing the steps with his gun raised, and without a shred of hesitation, Ethan tackled him from behind, the gun skidding across the wet boards, and the two of them crashed into the mud, grappling wildly. The second man charged toward them but was thrown off balance when Ethan kicked his knee, sending him stumbling, and Nia, desperate, terrified, but brave, grabbed the heavy cast iron pan from the stove and struck the second man across the head, dropping him instantly. Her hands shaking violently as she clutched the pan and stared at the fallen body. The first man recovered quickly, slamming his elbow into Ethan's ribs, but Ethan fought like someone who had finally found something worth bleeding for. And with a final surge, he pinned the man, shouting at Nia to grab the gun, and when she did, she pointed it with trembling hands, the barrel shaking but her eyes blazing with a strength she didn't know she possessed, and the sight of her, fierce and determined, froze the man beneath Ethan long enough for Ethan to knock him unconscious. When the clearing finally fell silent except for the ragged breathing of two people who had just fought for their lives and for each other, Nia dropped the gun and fell to her knees sobbing, the adrenaline collapsing inside her. And Ethan crawled to her, pulling her into his arms as she clung to him like he was the only solid thing in a collapsing world, and he held her just as tightly, whispering that it was over, that she was safe, that he had her and would continue to have her. And though they were both soaked, bruised, shaken to their bones, something warm flickered between them, something undeniable. Minutes later, when the sheriff, an older man with suspicion etched into his face, arrived after multiple 911 calls from a distant hunter who heard gunshots, Ethan explained everything, and though the sheriff was wary, the evidence was undeniable. The vehicle, the weapons, the unconscious men tied up with Ethan's old extension cords, and after running their plates, the sheriff's expression changed from suspicion to grim understanding, muttering that these men were connected to a larger investigation, one involving interstate financial crimes and trafficking, and Nia, terrified but resolute, agreed to give a statement, holding Ethan's hand the entire time. The aftermath unfolded over days. Protective custody, endless questioning, federal agents who arrived in black suits, files thick with evidence tying her former partner to a criminal enterprise that had used her identity without her knowledge. Evidence that finally cleared her name, freed her from the debts, and marked her as a key witness who would be legally protected going forward. Through all of it, Ethan never left her side, sleeping in hospital chairs, attending legal briefings, feeding the twins at 3 a.m., and somewhere between paperwork and exhaustion, between whispered conversations and shared fears, between the slow rebuilding of her sense of safety and the soft unfurling of his ability to feel again, they realized the truth neither dared say on that first night in the shack. That trauma had thrown them together, but something deeper was keeping them close. When the dust finally settled and the authorities deemed it safe for them to choose where to live, Ethan drove Nia and the twins not back to the shack, though it would always be the place where everything changed, but to the edge of a quiet coastal town where the sun touched the water in gold, and he showed her a small but beautiful house he'd purchased with wide windows and a porch perfect for sunsets, telling her it was hers if she wanted it, not because she needed rescuing but because he wanted a life with her, wanted to build something real, something gentle, something honest. And Nia, with tears streaming down her face and her children giggling in her arms, told him yes, not out of gratitude, not out of fear, but out of love she had finally let herself feel, the kind of love that grew in the ashes of survival and bloomed into something fierce and tender. Years later, when the twins ran around the yard and called Ethan Dad, without hesitation, when Nia kissed him under the slow setting sun, when laughter and peace filled the home where silence had once lived, the world finally understood what Ethan had known all along. From the moment he found her in that dusty shack, that sometimes the universe breaks you only to rebuild you with better pieces, and sometimes the family you're meant to have is the one you never expected to find, waiting in the most broken place you can imagine, but healing you in ways you never dreamed possible.